I've always had a thing for dangerous women.
I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are VIMTV. And today we'd like to talk to you about Fionn Regan's third album, 100 Acres of Sycamore. Fionn Regan is I think he's Irish. Irish singer-songwriter is really just the best term to describe this gentleman who writes just very, very pretty acoustic guitar parts and has a very distinct voice that I've grown to like over time. We reviewed, as a request a few months ago, his first album from 2006 entitled The End of History, which we liked when we reviewed it, and since then I've just fell in love with it. I can't stop listening to it. So I'm a little biased, and I've been really excited for 100 Acres of Sycamore to come out. Now, Fionn Regan had an additional album come out a few years ago, his follow-up to the debut, The Shadow of an Empire. I haven't actually listened to this, but what I've read is that it was a much more rocking album. He took his whole sound and completely shifted it. Some people liked that, some people didn't. And then now with 100 Acres of Sycamore, he went into this, like, I forget where it was, but it was this really obscure place out in kind of like the wilderness. And he just wrote most of these tracks. And so what you have is a return to what's being heralded as the return to the end of history's form of just having an acoustic folk sort of album. That's a criticism or a comparison that I really have had some struggles with. Because
it's not quite fair or really accurate,
no,
I'd say.
To me, it seems rather surface level, because I think when you start digging, you realize that the two albums are very different. Now, maybe in style, and maybe what's driving that is just because The Shadow of an Empire was so different in sound and style that this is just saying that now this is going back to that. But to break it up, to understand, because a lot of people really like The End of History, and quite honestly, I just want to come out and say I don't think it's on that level. No. I don't, and here's why. One, he did a few things differently on this release that I want to point out as things that separate it. And maybe these things may not make it better, they may not make it worse. However, they're there. One, there's strings all over this thing, and I think that he did a very good job of keeping the strings sounding natural. Yeah. Especially when you hear the cello, which is usually just not multiple layered strings, it's just the cello playing. I really enjoyed that.
They're also the first thing you hear on the album, so it really sets the stage for the rest of the album as a listen. It's like strings right away, and then the guitar comes in, and Fionn Regan starts singing.
Right.
So.
Yeah. The next thing I noticed was how quiet it was.
Yeah. Very soft.
Right. The whole dynamic of the album is just it's almost like he's whispering to you, and just these hushed vocals that it just doesn't have. It's a very good wintry album.
Well, and not only in volume is it soft, but also just in intensity. I mean, like End of History, you have a lot of songs that would be kind of quiet, but there's still this kind of like moving intensity underneath the song, and this doesn't have as much of that.
Right. The last thing I noticed was the fact that The End of History had these songs that would start, and then they would completely contort themselves and twist and go in a completely different direction by the end. These gigantic segues that really made the songs very interesting. By the time you would hear one part and get used to a verse or chorus, he would switch the entire song around. Where this 100 Acres of Sycamore is actually more simple in sound and song structure. You'll have just a repeated part over and over again for 3, 4, 5, and he actually gets up into some longer track lengths here, which when it isn't a big deal, and it's not like he didn't do that on previous albums. It's just that now it's just one part being repeated over and over again. Like he's going for the emotional resonance rather than the songwriting, power, showing off his songwriting.
Almost kind of like a Cass McCombs.
Right. Exactly.
We mentioned in his album Wits End.
So the net effect of all these changes is really just a more subdued album. It is, while focused, it lacks an intensity. It lacks that hook that just continues to get me about The End of History, and what's made The End of History kind of an underground classic over the past 5-6 years.
I would say also that his vocals, while he does a very good vocal performance, they're almost a little too clean for me.
Are.
They don't quite emote the same.
Now, you mentioned to me a week or two ago about this album that you actually felt like you couldn't hear his accent come through.
Yeah. It sounds much more Midwestern.
Right. Yeah,
almost.
you can't even
I don't
tell
get that. I don't get that
Irish.
Irish inflection, which really can be an endearing part of the music.
Absolutely.
And I mean, you can't take that into account too much. You can't fault the guy for it too much. I mean, if his voice is evolving, he's trying different things. That's cool, but it's just something that I felt set him apart that just isn't quite bringing that unique flavor anymore.
And there's still a number of tracks on here that I feel like he really captures a good emotion that I really got into. The opening track, 100 Acres of Sycamore, track 5, Dogwood Blossom, and then later in the album he has the track Woodberry Cemetery. And I really enjoyed those tracks. I felt like they were more intimate and actually worked with the style he took it. The tracks that were more based on the acoustic parts that were similar to the End of History but just had the different changes that he made, I didn't feel like he pulled off quite as well.
Yeah, I really do like that he didn't overdo this album.
Right.
I think there were a lot of places where he showed really good tact and not just cluttering the mix up with all sorts of extra stuff. I mean, he keeps it pretty simple, pretty sharp with just like the guitar and the strings and his vocals. But at the same time, I feel like the songwriting just isn't consistently quite as strong as it could be.
Right, and it's just not as catchy as I'd like it to be. Overall, I'm sitting at a 69 with this. It's at that cusp of just being a solid album, but there's some things that I would improve if I were sitting in the studio with Fionn Regan coaching him.
I'm going 72. I like it a little better.
Right.
It's good straight through, but it could have been better.
Yep. What do you guys think? Let us know at www.velocitiesandmusic.com or youtube.com/velocitiesandmusic. Also, follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. That's where we do most of our talking about all the albums that we're constantly listening to. So get involved in the conversation. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are VIMTV, moving music critique forward.
Bottles and brown paper in the mouth.